I'm Spooky, creator of Lycan's Nocturne, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics podcast.
Welcome to a special edition of the True North Country Comics podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. It's May 28th, 2021. I'm John Swinimer. If you want to drop me a line, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. These podcasts are published to celebrate the exhibitors of this year's virtual edition of the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. TCAF is an annual event gathering comic book creators from around the world to promote broad and diverse voices towards the betterment of the medium of comics through panels, keynote exclusives, and just basically enjoying the fun of comics. On this episode, I chat with Spooky about Lycan's Nocturne at TCAF 2021. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. It's also available on the True North Country Comics channel on YouTube. I invite you to like and subscribe. Shiver Spooky, also known as Spooky, is a non-binary webcomic artist with a love for monsters and fantasy. They love to write LGBTQA+ comics, particularly love stories and adventure stories. They are most known for the webcomic Lycan's Nocturne, a queer story about werewolves and magical places. Spooky also creates many zines and mini-comics, their most popular being I Am Just a Little Creature, a zine about being non-binary. And so, without further ado, here's my chat with Spooky about Lycan's Nocturne at TCAF 2021. So, Spooky, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate your time. What I normally do to start off the interview is ask creators about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
I actually have a very vivid memory of this. My first comics were Archie comics. I feel like a lot of people get their start in reading comics that way. But yeah, I remember I was going on like a plane trip with my family, and to keep me entertained, like my mom bought me like a Betty and Veronica comic book, and from there it was like a whole collection. Just my life now revolves around comics because of that one fateful day.
I think some really good market research people figured they'd put them at checkout stands at supermarkets and places where you're going on trips. I think just for that very purpose. So
yeah, they knew me specifically. They were like, we're going to get this one. And they did.
Very good. Very good. So Archie is definitely a good influence. I've talked to a lot of creators, and that definitely is heard quite a bit. But I'm wondering who influences your work today?
Oh, man. So many. Yeah, I actually... I know when I was really little, like in like elementary school, like I was reading Archie comics and stuff, and then like I didn't really start doing comics of my own until I guess maybe high school, and that's when I was like super into manga. I still am to this day. I think some personal favorites that like really influenced my work, and you can kind of see it in my comics now, are like the Legend of Zelda manga. Number one huge influence. Twilight Princess is like my favorite one. I was like really into like Fruits Basket, Blue Exorcist, stuff like that. And yeah, so those are like very personal favorites. I think like after I got into manga, I started kind of branching out into other artists and like I guess more I don't know, like independent graphic novels, I guess. Not necessarily independent, but like I guess like other webcomics, or like some recent favorites that I really like are like the Adventure Zone comics by that are illustrated by Carrie Peach. I think she's one of my favorite cartoonists right now. And I think like, I'm also a huge fan of like Becky Cloonan and all of the comics that are written by like Gerard Way. Those are huge impacts on me right now. But yeah, oh man, I could give you like a whole TED talk. I'm trying to reel it in.
Okay, no, that's good. There's a lot of good stuff there, that's for sure. So we're here talking about the Toronto Comic Arts Festival that just concluded, but I'm wondering if we could discuss a wee bit more about what you exhibited at that show. Maybe you could talk a bit about the book there and maybe the origins of the project as well.
Yeah, so I exhibited a few mini zines and comics at TCAF, but the main one that I was really pumped to get out there was my webcomic Lycan's Nocturne. But yeah, so it's Lycan's Nocturne is like this kind of high fantasy webcomic. The way that I like to describe it, it's got werewolves and swords and adventures, and it's my first webcomic that I wrote like ages ago, and like didn't start publishing it online until like 2018 or something. So yeah, I guess like if you, for any potential readers out there, if you're interested in reading fantasy, if you like monsters and you want to read like a cool like LGBT adventure story, I guess just like maybe recommend my webcomic to you. Basically, Lycan's Nocturne is about this boy named Ari who one day just finds an injured boy in the woods. That boy turns out to be a werewolf, and they suddenly just find their lives just kind of intertwined with each other, and they now have to just go on this adventure to this place where they're trying to that might have the cure to this werewolf curse, but also who knows? We'll, we're not quite there yet. And along the way, they just kind of find themselves getting into like a lot of trouble and also kind of falling in love at the same time. If that sounds like something that you'd like to read, go for it.
Well, what was the initial idea behind it?
The main premise of my webcomic, it's kind of like it's basically about a medieval fantasy kind of setting, and which is all and medieval fantasy has always been like my favorite setting for reading kind of anything. Like all the books that I read growing up, all like my favorite webcomics that I used to read. So I knew when I wanted to do a comic, I wanted to do a fantasy one because it's just what I like. And then I think I was and still am like very like self-conscious about like what I was actually able to draw. So I remember like sitting there one day while like trying to sketch out ideas for a comic, and I was like, okay, I want to draw like a fantasy web comic. What do I like drawing, and what am I good at drawing? And I'm like, okay, I like to kind of draw like these like anime kind of fantasy characters. And what am I good at drawing? I'm really good at drawing dogs and wolves, so I'm going to put that together somehow. And now I have a fantasy werewolf comic that I have worked on for like 4 years since.
Wow, there you go. So you're comfortable with it. I think when I talk to a lot of people, they traditionally say that you've got to write for yourself first. You
Yeah,
know,
absolutely.
and that's the way to start. And it seems like that's what you're doing. So it's great. Super. I want to switch gears a wee bit here and talk about the tools that you use to create your art. I presume you're a digital artist?
Yes, my comic is done entirely digitally.
Okay, can you walk me through your workflow process? Maybe explain the tools and software that you use.
Yeah, so the comic is completely drawn on Clip Studio Paint, and I used to use like an old Wacom tablet, but I recently started using an iPad instead. So that's actually kind of helped, I guess, kind of streamline the process a little bit because now I just have one little simple workstation I can bring with me everywhere. I pretty much just sketch and draw and color everything on Clip Studio. That's probably like the best program that I've ever used for comics. Not I remember when I first wrote the comic, I actually just like would draw all of it like by hand on like pencil and paper, and then I made
Mm-hmm.
the switch to digital, and that kind of opened up more opportunities for me to make it like more full color and stuff like that.
Super. Now, I also was reading on online about you that you were at OCAD,
Yes, I
Ontario
was.
College of Art and Design, I believe it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah, what was that experience like? Because I know a lot of people when they come to the site, they're very keen on learning about where to go to study about making comics, and I'm just curious about your experience. Maybe you could share some of what you went through there.
Yeah, for sure. So I was in the illustration program, and I think like it's um, at first and like throughout the program, it was very much like teaching us about like how to do illustration for editorial work and like magazines and stuff like that. But there were really good comics and like graphic novel illustration classes. I think more in like my third and final year. So what my main first impression was of their kind of comic classes was it really wasn't what I was expecting, but in a good way.
Hmm.
When I was kind of self-teaching myself comics, like it was very much like I don't know, just like very like here's how you write a script, here's how you do this, very like step by step, and that was all very helpful. But like OCAD has this kind of unconventional, just kind of go for it approach, and was pretty open to like different styles and different ways of doing comics. Like I always did kind of like long form story driven comics. Like that's what like Lycan's Nocturne is. It's a really long story that I've been writing for a while. With OCAD, we would get like these different like exercises that were like, oh, make a comic, but it's only like 4 panels.
Oh,
Tell us a
wow.
story in like 2 pages. Yeah, it was hard. Like the shorter they
Yeah.
were, the harder it was. Like, I remember one of the first assignments that I got was, yeah, you had to do a 4 panel comic, And my professor was like, they don't have to be funny, but like you can just try to do like a narrative in 4 panels. But my brain like really was bent on making it funny, so like I spent like 3 hours just trying to write jokes that would land.
It's a tricky thing. Like most of the people would look at, let's say, Charlie Brown, for example, Peanuts,
Hmm.
and say, "Oh, that looks so simple." But in retrospect, I mean, that you have to plan, as you say, ahead, and you've got to put a lot of thought in it to compress everything to get your idea across. So it's more work than most people think, I'm sure.
Yeah, it really is. Like I said, like I think at least for me, like the shorter comics were just so much more difficult because they basically like you're forced to take out unnecessary parts of a narrative and just kind of really pare it down so that it's the most like communicative right away. And I think that really helped me in the long run. If I compare like that stuff to my main webcomic, I remember when I was first working on Lycan's Nocturne, a lot of the, I guess, critiques that I would get. Like I get like a lot of very kind comments from my readers, and I'm very grateful for that. But I remember like one comment that I would get that would kind of bother me. People would be like, "Oh, it's like really slow paced," and I'm like, "Is it really?" And then I reread it, and I'm like, "Yeah, there's so much here that I could just chop out and just like kind of just improve and make it just streamline it a little bit more." And I find as I continue to like write the different chapters, like I'm currently writing like the 6th chapter now, and I've only self-published the first one so far. So I've come a long way from when I first started. I find like I'm really picking up the pace both in like in more ways than one. How I write it and how like just the story is going. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so I think
Yeah,
that's a really valuable thing that I picked
sure.
up.
Absolutely. No, that's good stuff to hear. That's for sure. So definitely well recommended is what you're saying. OCAD might be a good place to go.
Yeah, it's a funky place, and if you're from Toronto and if you've passed by the building and taken one look at it, yeah, it's pretty wild. It's pretty interesting to say the least, architecture wise, and just everything about it.
Super, super. So we're talking about TCAF, and in addition to meeting people and networking, it's also an opportunity for others to come up and ask questions to the creators. And one of those questions is typically, I'm making my own comic book. What advice do you have? So what advice would you give to someone who would come up to you and say, I'm making my own comic book? What do I do?
Honestly, take care of yourself and pace yourself. Don't overwork. I know that I feel like that sounds kind of vague, but it's so, I guess, easy to kind of just obsess over working on your story and wanting to get it done faster and faster and get more pages done. At least that's been my experience. And I find sometimes like that can lead to like feeling very drained and just I'm just being very tired of your own story sometimes. And like it's I think as a creator, like you need to remember that it's okay to take a break. And sometimes you just need to like as much as you love your own characters and your own story, sometimes you just like need to take a step back, do something else, go outside, I don't know, do anything, and then come back to it. I'm a bit of a workaholic, so that's just something that I found that I need to remember, especially like through like quarantine and everything. It was so easy for me to like kind of just be stuck in my room for 6 hours, just like drawing pages all the time. And after a while, I was like, I need to work smarter instead of like recklessly harder. So I think that's something that I think a lot of young comic creators need to remember.
That's good advice for sure. Absolutely. In addition to asking for advice and meeting people at various conventions and festivals, also about buying books. So I'm wondering, where do you recommend people go to buy your books?
So actually, right now I don't have a shop, unfortunately. I've been getting questions on like when I'm gonna open like an online store, but that's currently in the works. As of right now, I do run a Patreon for when my comics pages are ready to be posted. As of right now, that's also on hiatus, just with like the hectic nature of like trying to write a new chapter that I can post on there. But Patreon is where I'll post like chapters and pages way ahead of when I post it free to read online. So yeah, that's probably the best way to support right now.
Okay, cool. So you're talking about getting your chapters done and you're still working on them. I'm wondering if you could talk about what's next for you. Do you have any other projects you can talk about?
Honestly, so many. It's kind of interesting because it's like I have so many projects that I want to do, but also at the same time, like Lycan's Nocturne is my only project that I'm working on. I think as of right now, I'm currently, I think, reached the halfway point of the overall story. So that's definitely a milestone for me. But I think this story is going to keep me kind of wrapped up for at least a few more years. But afterwards, I definitely have a lot of different stories and genres that I want to go into. I kind of approached like new projects kind of genre based. So like right now I'm doing like medieval fantasy with monsters and stuff. And next, like I know for sure like, hey, I want to try like steampunk. I want to maybe try like sci-fi. So like we'll see where that goes.
Cool. That sounds very exciting, for sure, for sure. So where do you recommend people go online to find out more about your current and future projects?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram and Tumblr at Shiver Spooky. That's my name on all of those. And you can read Lycan's Nocturne on Webtoon and Tapas. I think I have the first 5 chapters completely up on both of those.
Thanks to Spooky for the chat. You can discover more about Spooky on Twitter and Instagram at Shiver Spooky, and Lycan's Nocturne is available online at shiversspooky.wixsite.com/LYCANS-NOCTURNE. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts, and please leave a good rating. Also, check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at True North Comics. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2021.